We don't want to be known as the late Chassidus shir. Anyway. We are making our way line by line, word by word, letter by letter through the second chapter of the second part of the Tanya. We are discussing the unity of God with the world and how the nature of the world is nothing but, the true reality of the world is that the world is nothing but an expression of godliness. And we're actually in the middle of discussing the Alter Rebbe's metaphor for this. The Alter Rebbe says that the heretics, the minim, those who make a mistake about God, think that God creates the world the same way a human craftsman creates an artifact or creates an object. The example we've been using is a silversmith making a silver menorah. That the silversmith creates an object in a way that is not true creation. He creates it in a way of something from something. And all he really does when he creates a menorah from a block of silver, from ingots of silver, is he is taking a potential that the silver has to be in the form of a menorah, and he is bringing that potential into actuality. Or to put it in a more simple way, the silver as it is a block of silver, and the silver as it is a menorah, is just two different ways for silver to be. Therefore, since all the artisan really does is he helps silver be in a different way, silver that already was before he arrived, and he makes it into a different form, he makes it be in a different fashion. Therefore, he can depart and leave his silver menorah on the table. He can go walking in the marketplace and the menorah is still there. In other words, in creation, yesh mi yesh, something from something. In the act of formation, of bringing out a potential form into actuality, there does not need to be the constant involvement of the artisan. The artisan does not need to be always involved. As opposed to the way that God creates the world, as we know in Judaism, is yesh ma'ayin, is something from nothing. And in something from nothing, nothing cannot be in a way of something, right? The way that silver can be in a way of a menorah, or the way of a block of silver. A different way of saying this is that nothing has no potential to be anything. That's what makes it nothing. If it could have a potential, it would be something, but it's not, it's nothing. It has no potential to be anything. Therefore, when God creates something from nothing, what that really means is that the something that is created is in a state of constant dependence upon God. It is constantly relying on God to create it, and it is in fact nothing other than an expression of God. And if God were to, so to speak, go walking in the marketplace and stop speaking the world into existence, stop expressing the world as an existence, the world would return to a state of absolute nothingness as it was before the 6 days of creation. Because the entire existence of the world, milichatchila, from the first place, is really just an expression of God, rather than depending on some sort of pre-existing existence as the menorah does, on the block of silver which pre-existed. Then, we've been speaking about the last 3 weeks, we've moved into the Alter Rebbe's metaphor, the Alter Rebbe's mashal for this. What is the example to help us understand the way that God creates the world something from nothing? The example is Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea before the Hebrews, that the Hebrews crossed over on dry land. Why is this the metaphor? Because just as the Torah says that God made the eastern wind blow the whole night, and the sea stood like a wall, and as soon as the wind stopped blowing, the sea returned again to its state of lying flat, so too is God constantly involved in the world's creation. In other words, the two things are comparable fundamentally, because even though obviously the splitting of the sea is not a true act of yesh ma'ayin, as we discussed in great length last week, is not a true act of creation ex nihilo, because the water exists already, and all God is doing at the splitting of the sea is imposing a new nature on the water, a nature on the water to stand like a wall. Nevertheless, relatively speaking, this is an act of creation, something from nothing, because water has no potential to stand like a wall. The entire standing like a wall nature that the water had on that occasion was entirely dependent on God, and therefore it required his constant involvement. That is why there was a wind blowing all the night, because if you are giving an entirely new nature, if you are creating something that is entirely new within the water, and there is no potential in the water for this to be, then it requires God's constant involvement. This metaphor of the splitting of the sea, we've had many diyukim, we've had many examinations of the precise nature of the text. There's many details here, and many different things. We're probably going to miss some in the review just naturally. But a few of the major points that we've gone over is that, number one, the Alter Rebbe, when he brings the metaphor of the splitting of the sea, right, is using this metaphor as opposed to a more common occurrence, because it is only from a metaphor in Torah. It is only from a Torah act where God tells us, this is how I behave when I impose a new nature upon something, when I create something from nothing, that we are able to apply it to God at all. If it were not a source in Torah, if it were just human reason, then according to Chassidus, according to the Alter Rebbe, there would be no capacity for the human explanation to bind God, so to speak, or to necessitate that God should act in a certain way. In other words, given that creation is something from nothing, it is absolutely logical and necessary, the Alter Rebbe argues, that the involvement of the Creator must be constant. However, there is no reason necessarily for God to obey the laws of logic, according to Chassidus. There is no reason God has to act within that framework. According to the Alter Rebbe's position, God is fundamentally able to do anything. If he wanted to, he could do something contradictory. He could create the world in such a way that was logically necessitates his constant involvement, and decide that he is not going to be involved. And we find such logical contradictions in Torah, such things that are impossible. God can do that if he wishes. So it is only the Torah source, which is a revelation, a prophecy, in which God tells man, this is how I behave, that we know that God in these matters follows the laws of logic. He does what the human mind would logically say that he does in the splitting of the sea. We also have said on the splitting of the sea that the Alter Rebbe brings two words for wall, a neid and a chema, right, which are two aspects of the miracle, because in fact it is not the physical wind which is holding up the water as a wall the whole night. Rather, the water actually acquired a new nature in an internal way of standing like a wall. Yet we need both aspects. We need the blowing of the wind the whole night, and we need the changing nature of the wall internally as a true demonstration of creation something from nothing. Because to create something from nothing, number one, is a demonstration of constant involvement, which is the wind blowing all the night. But on the other hand, if it was just the wind blowing all night, then we could say that it wasn't really a creation in the water at all, rather just a putting the water in a new container, right? Just as the water laying in the seabed naturally is not miraculous, is not something from nothing, so too water in a cup or in some other container which holds it in a certain shape. So if the wind were to form that container and, so to speak, hold the water in, then the wind would be miraculous, but the standing as a wall of the water would not be miraculous. The standing of the wall as a wall of the water would be natural. Therefore, the wind not only blows the whole night, but also changes the nature of the wall, which is why the Alter Rebbe uses two words for wall, neid and chema, because the two words for wall indicate the two stages of this miracle. I'm reviewing very quickly. What else did we say? We said we moved on and read a few more lines last week in the Tanya about the splitting of the sea. And we essentially read that the Alter Rebbe says that this is an argument of kal v'chemer, right? From minakal la kaved, we go from the small case to the large case, the smaller case to the more difficult case. A fortiori, I think, pronounced in Latin, something like that. where if God does it this way in the splitting of the sea, and the splitting of the sea it demands his constant involvement, then all the more so the greater miracle, which is the creation of heaven and earth, the greater something from nothing, must demand God's constant involvement, right? Which is why last week we touched on the point that this truly is a new nature in the water. It is not that God is creating something new entirely that is not water, right? That has a totally different nature, right? It is not that God is. Not performing a miracle in the water, which we really negated in the past few weeks. Rather, the water remains water. The water has a nature of flowing, and that nature of flowing is what changed. And as we demonstrated last week, the flowing is not a fundamental nature of all matter, because there is some matter which stands as a wall naturally. Some matter, like stones, right, when placed as a wall, will stand as a wall, or Legos, right, have the nature of standing as a wall quite naturally. So we see that the water's nature to flow does not come from its materiality or its physicality, the fact that it's made up of matter, but is rather an additional nature in water. And when God creates the splitting of the sea, he is changing that nature in water. It is like creation, something from nothing. He is giving the water a nature. He is forming the water into something that it has no potential for being, right?
Temporarily.
Yeah. Just like our other metaphor of the rock that's thrown up into the air is the same thing. The rock has no potential to fly in the air. The only reason the rock's flight through the air is taking place is because the invested energy from the arm is constantly acting against the nature of the rock to fall to the earth, right, under the force of gravity. And as soon as the energy of the arm runs out, it immediately plummets to the earth. In other words, the nature of the rock as a flying rock does not really exist in the rock at all. The rock does not become a flying rock. The flying of the rock only exists as an expression of the invested energy in the rock. The exact same thing with the splitting of the sea. The water does not become standing water, wall-standing water. Why is it standing like a wall? Why does it have this nature? Only because God is constantly involved in that process. And this is the metaphor for creation, something from nothing. This is what the heretic mistakes and does not understand, that when God creates the world, it is even more of a something from nothing. He is not just changing one nature in the water. He is literally going from nothing to something, from no potential for anything, to an existence. And to be able to do that, to create something from nothing, demands God's constant involvement. Because if God were not constantly involved, the world would revert back to absolute nothingness, because its being, its very being, is only an expression of the power invested. Just like the rock, and just like the flight of the rock, and just like the standing as a wall of the sea. That's basically what we've said until now. Today we're going to do something almost, in a way, a little bit parenthetical, but a very interesting topic. We're going to have to answer an important question to really understand what's going on here, and this will set us up. We're not done with chapter 2 yet, but this will set us up to finish chapter 2 and move on to chapter 3, God willing, today's discussion. Because chapter 3, you really want to understand chapter 2 before you move on to chapter 3, which will be deepening and inevitably complicating, but also deepening our understanding of what we're talking about in chapter 2. L'chaim. So, pardon me. Here's the fundamental issue, right? Here's the issue with what the Alter Rebbe said until now. We mentioned in our previous discussion on miracles, really when we were talking about the two different types of wall that's mentioned here in Tanya, we mentioned that there's a different sort of miracle in the Torah that we see does not require God's constant involvement. In fact, there's many miracles in the Torah that do not seem to involve God's constant presence, God does not seem to constantly make these miracles happen, right? The example that Rabbi Yoel uses is the sign that Moshe Rabbeinu showed the Egyptians, that his hand was healthy, and then he put it in his shirt and it became infected with tsaras, the famous impure skin ailment described in the Torah. And then he put his hand back in his shirt and he pulled it out and it was completely healthy once more, right? So in that miracle, as we discussed previously, the entire miracle is in the transition from one state to the other, right? It's not miraculous to have a hand that has tsaras, right? A hand can have a rash, can have an ailment more or less naturally, right, as we perceive it. There's nothing miraculous in that. The miracle is that it's healthy one moment, then it has the tsaras in another moment, and then the tsaras is also taken away in an instant, in a moment. That's the miracle. So the miracle is not really in the act as it is taking place. The miracle, the sign to the Jewish people was not, look, my hand constantly has tsaras now. The sign to the Jewish people was in the transition from one state to the other and back. Yes? That's a miracle that there's an example of where God, it's not a constant involvement from God, at least not, the Torah doesn't make it explicit anyway. Obviously with the caveat that obviously everything is the constant involvement of God because everything is constantly created from nothing. That's the whole point of the chapter in Tanya. But the point is that the emphasis with these miracles in the Torah was not on God's constant involvement in the miracle, but rather that, because obviously, let's step back one more step. Obviously, the Torah believes that there are natures in the world. There is a difference between a nature and a miracle, according to Torah. Obviously, there's a difference between a nature and a miracle, right? The way for something to be naturally, in and of itself, the way that something is by the definition of what it is, according to its mahus, according to its God-given essence, right, is something's nature. The miracle changes that nature. So it's within the nature of the hand to be healthy, and it's also within the nature of the hand that it's possible for it to have tsaras. The only thing that's not within the nature of the hand, the miraculous thing, is that it should go from being healthy to being totally covered in tsaras in a moment, and back. That's what is not within the regular nature as is given to the hand.
But is it two miracles or one?
Two. Pashtus 2. The simple reading, two miracles. The first miracle that it should have the tsaras. The second miracle that it should stop having the tsaras. It would seem from the simple understanding of the miracle. Now, here's the question. The question is, when it comes to the splitting of the sea, which is the Alter Rebbe's miracle here, right? It's obvious that the splitting of the sea emphasizes God's constant involvement. And it's obvious to see why. Because the water's nature is to lie flat, and yet it stood up as a wall for an extended period of time. Therefore, every moment of the miracle was obviously miraculous. In other words, every moment that the sea stood like a wall and that the sea was split was in clear violation of the regular nature of the water. Yes, every moment was miraculous. Not like a hand that has tsaras, which a hand can just have tsaras. A hand can have an ailment. Water does not stand like a wall. Therefore, it is logical that God should be constantly involved. Now, it's true. You could say that He truly changed the nature of the water. That's why we have our whole thing about how, but the wind also blew the whole night to demonstrate to us that that is not what was taking place. Right? It is not that God changed the nature of the water such that it could just stand on its own and this became its new nature for a time. Per se, God was making this unnatural thing to the water, this thing which is totally foreign to the water, take place for a few hours. That's really what the Torah is trying to tell us with the two words for wall, etc., and as we've said in previous classes. I don't mean to overly complicate things, I'm just in case anyone was confused, because we're saying almost two opposite things. It's not really two opposites. The water is standing like a wall, but it is God imposing that externally. He is imposing it in the water. The water is changing. The nature of the water is changing. But how is it changing? Because only of God's constant involvement. So it's a little subtle, but that's essentially what we're saying. That's not the main point. I don't mean to confuse things here.
No, but there is a problem.
Yeah.
Because when Yeshua crossed the Jordan River.
Yeah.
The water stood as well.
Yeah.
And Elijah, he put his coat on the water. Not Elijah. Elijah with his
Elisha?
Elisha, yeah. When they crossed the river, I mean, it was the same thing. He just pulled his coat over the water and then stopped. So maybe the water does have that character that we don't know how to do it, but some people do. Of course, God does as well.
No, you're complicated.
It depends what you mean by nature, but that's not what we're talking about now. That's a fair point. That's not for now. That's a fair point. I think it comes down to what you mean by nature. Clearly, there's nature and then there's higher nature,
no,
right?
It's like there's a nature that we know, and maybe there's some other things that we simply don't.
No, but the thing is that the nature that we know is not just arbitrary. It's not like, I happen to never discover that you could walk across the water on a bendel like the Baal Shem Tov, right? It's not that I happen to never discover it, right? It's that really the water does not allow for such a thing. Right? And it is miraculous when someone does it. Now the question is, what is the nature of the miracle, right? Is the miracle a pure imposition completely of God's will, totally uninvested in any process whatsoever, in which case you'd say it has nothing to do with the water's nature, it's just God is saying such a thing should be and so it is, or God willed such a thing to be and so it is? Or is there a manipulation, like a Kabbalistic manipulation, which is what the practical Kabbalah is all about, a practical manipulation of the nature of the water as it is created, right? But that's not a manipulation of the nature of the water as it usually is in the world. That would be a manipulation of the divine letters of which water consists, right? You're reprogramming nature in a way, but it is a reprogramming. Clearly, you can't walk across water as a normal person. So the question now is: so if water can be so reprogrammed, does that mean that it's in the nature of water that if someone knows enough Kabbalah, they can walk across the water, right? I don't know if that's really an applicable question. That's all I'm saying.
The question is a relevant question. The question was the answer.
Okay, so the question here is, I didn't mean to get distracted. The main question here is, right, the hand that has tsaras is something that could happen, at least theoretically, according to the simple understanding, without God's constant involvement. The standing of the sea as a wall, according to the simple understanding, without all the subtleties which we've been going over the past few weeks, is something which cannot happen without God's constant involvement. It's something which is miraculous per se. It's miraculous in and of itself. Not just the transition from the water lying flat to the water standing as a wall, but if you see water standing as a wall, you think, my goodness, something strange is going on. You don't think, oh look, the water is just a wall, right? It's just a standing wall. So the question becomes, when we take the splitting of the sea, and we use the kal v'chemer, and we apply, if this is the case by the splitting of the sea, all the more so by the creation of the universe, something from nothing, right? The question becomes, which one of these two is the creation of the universe, something from nothing? Because at the simplest level, especially, I would say especially to the man on the street in 2018, maybe even more so than in previous times in history. To look at the world is not to look at the existence of something, to look at existence per se, that something exists, is not to look at something that seems out of the ordinary or extraordinary. Right, is not to look at something which seems miraculous. When you look at the cup, and the cup exists, do you approach it in a way of the hand that has tsaras, that I understand that it's miraculous that God made something from nothing, but now that something is here, it seems entirely natural that it should persist and continue to be here? Or do we actually look at it in the way of the splitting of the sea, which is that this is something which is totally contradictory, and God's involvement must be constant to make this make sense, right? Now,
can you just distill the fundamental question?
The fundamental question is the fundamental question is existence per se something which seems contradictory, like the water standing as a wall, and therefore demanding God's...
Is existence
per se, that something should exist.
Contradictory.
Contradictory, like the sea standing as a wall.
Right.
In other words, I could put the question differently, maybe a little bit easier way. The different way of putting the question is that in the splitting of the sea, the water has a nature, right? We make a kal v'chomer. Let's go back. We make an easy, a light to a difficult argument, as is made in the Gemara all the time. If it applies to the sea, it must apply to the creation of the world something from nothing, because the creation of the world something from nothing is a much greater miracle than the splitting of the sea. But I could argue to you that the splitting of the sea is a greater miracle than the creation of the world something from nothing. Why? Why is the splitting of the sea a greater miracle, a greater expression of God's power, of God's dominion, a greater expression of God's constant involvement than the creation of the universe something from nothing? Because the water has a pre-existing nature to flow and not to stand as a wall. And every moment that it stands as a wall, it is obvious that God is imposing something upon the water, is doing something to the water that is not natural, right? Is bringing out an actuality that was never in the water in potential, right? Which is another way of saying he's doing a miracle. He's doing something that cannot be.
It's much greater to impose nothing to be something.
One second. You would think that it's greater than nothing to be something, and that has a certain common sense ring of truth about it. However, the thing is that nothing has no nature that is being contradicted.
Not being.
No, that's not it's just nothing. It's not being. It's not something that's not being, right? Here's the question. It's not something that's not being. It's just nothing. Here's the question.
The continuum is nothing to something, and then something to something else.
That's what he's trying to say.
Let me tell you.
But the thing is like this, right? Do you understand the question? The question is, when we see the sea is split, right? We see that the water is doing something which is clearly God's imposition contrary to its nature. Nothing has no nature. So it's creating something out of nothing. That something should exist does not seem to be an imposition. It does not seem to be contradictory to what was there before. In a way, it's obviously greater because there is something here where absolutely nothing was before, as opposed to water just acquiring a new nature. But on the other hand, the new nature of the water is obviously a contradiction to the regular nature of the water. The water standing as a wall is obviously an external imposition. The creating of the world, something from nothing, is not an imposition. In other words, the creating of the world, something from nothing, is miraculous maybe in the first moment, because something has to be created. But now that something is created, why can't it just continue on naturally? It's not like water standing like a wall. There's just something, right? This is an implicit question on the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe does not address this question in the Tanya. Rabbi Yoel brings up this question.
It's a difficult issue, and of course I don't want to be kafir or heretic. That's the right term to say it, but it is really something that simply we do not know, and everything we do not know seems to be like magic or miracle. And I'll give you two examples. So the first one, we all know the story of the daughter of a rabbi, and she had to bring oil for Shabbat, and she mixed up and she brought vinegar. So she was like very nervous. What am I going to do? And they told her, look, don't worry. Whoever made the oil to light, will make the vinegar to light.
Yes.
So is that considered to be a miracle?
Fasting, of course, it's a miracle.
Maybe vinegar could turn to be, with certain things, vinegar could turn to light. That's one thing. The other thing is like, if you'd ask people from, let's say, 100 years ago, can light kill someone? Said no, that's going to be a miracle. Today you put a laser light, boom, you can explode things with laser. So there are certain things that we do not know, and for us, and obviously people that lived years ago, and even for now today, splitting of the Red Sea, or the Yam Suf, it's like a miracle. But maybe there are some ways that we simply do not know.
I fantastically and profoundly disagree with you, but it's good that you bring up the point, because that actually brings me to my next point. It's good that you bring it up, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Right? It's a famous, it was phrased, I think, by Arthur C. Clarke, a very famous science fiction author, right? He said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? Which is essentially what you're saying, right? The real question is whether any sufficiently regressive magic is indistinguishable from technology is really the question, right? Asking it all wrong, right? You're saying because technology can do things that we don't understand, and if you take any advanced technology and show it to someone they're not familiar with, it seems to them as if it's a miracle, as if it's something impossible. But that doesn't mean that every miracle fundamentally reduces down to something that can be accomplished by technology, which is exactly the point, one of the points that we want to discuss here. How much time do we have left? Okay.
Oh, you have a mathematician here, and he can tell you the moment you have he's a mathematician. And there is an axioma. The moment you break that axioma, it becomes like nothing because you broke the rule. So
I'm going to fucking honest. I think you're saying that the event itself was so profoundly different, that it went above and beyond the mere question
the nature of the material.
What are we doing here in the first place? Mm-hmm. Which is a fundamental question, okay? Which is, many people think that's what promulgated religion. And then you have this event that just flew against anything that anybody had ever seen before. And it never happened again. Or maybe it did, I don't know. But that was it. So that's it.
In our life.
But the interesting question is how it was recorded in history. In other words, we have one record of it, and that's the Torah.
For sure, miracle.
That's the record of it. That was the newspaper of the day, right?
The only before I get on to what I want to talk about before, the only relevance of the entire occurrence in the first place for our discussion is the fact that it's in the Torah. Because as I said before, if it wasn't a self-description of God describing how he himself does such things, then it would actually be not usable in the Tanya. It wouldn't really be relevant. It would be like the throwing of the rock, which is a nice example, but cannot be said to say anything about God. So in other words, the whole relevance of the thing is that it's in the Torah in the first place. But I don't want to get too caught up in all of those sorts of things. It's an interesting discussion. There's lots of different roads to go down with that discussion. But I want to ask...
Is there an aha moment out of all this?
I don't understand what that means.
Of course there is. Splitting the water, it's like beyond...
That's an aha moment, that's for sure.
And that's why it's called miracle.
I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know. I don't actually know what any of you are talking about. So I'm just gonna talk about
Let's move on.
what I wanted to talk about.
Tanya, how about that? Written by a very, very holy person who kind of knew what he was talking about, as opposed to us.
Let's talk about it like this. So we have a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is, for our understanding of the Tanya, is that the splitting of the sea seems to obviously involve a contradiction or a new nature, or to be more technical, a new nature imposed on the water, and therefore obviously requires the involvement of God, as opposed to the existence of the universe, which perhaps only initially we would not understand and requires the creation of God, something from nothing. But to simply continue in existence does not seem to be a contradiction to any nature or anything like that. So how can we say that the splitting of the sea is a kal v'chomer to the creation of the universe? How can we say that the creation of the universe is more miraculous when just existence itself does not seem to be, in the human experience, as miraculous, or the imposition of a new nature, as the splitting of the sea does? And the answer is like this, or the beginning of the answer. It's a preface before we get to the answer to this question. The preface to the answer is that the fundamental question since antiquity that spurs on all philosophical discussion, the fundamental question of the human mind unencumbered by ideologies, really the fundamental question of a child encountering the world, is really the first time it comes up, is why is anything here at all? The fundamental question of the human mind meeting the world is the realization that the fact that something exists does not necessitate that it should be here. Again, the fact that something is here does not necessitate that it should be here. It happens to be here, it would seem, but it doesn't have to be. And this is something that has bothered the human mind since antiquity, since the earliest philosophers. I believe Liadi, Socrates talks about such a thing, that the beginning of all philosophical inquiry is the astonishment that things are here, but they don't have to be here this way. Why is this the fundamental question of philosophy? Because a human being is endowed with something that is truly, has yet to be explained by any technology, is truly miraculous, which is a human being has a mind capable of abstract thinking. And the mind which is capable of abstract thinking is able to know things that to the mind it seems like they must be. It must be. 2 + 2 must be 4, right? The Pythagorean theorem must be. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, right? Must be so, right? But when I look at the world around me, and most things about the world, including the most fundamental fact about the world, about everything in the world, which is that it is here at all, the difference between ayin and yesh, the difference between nothing and something, the mind does not see the same necessity that it sees in 2 + 2 = 4. There is something here, but I see no reason why it must be here. This has annoyed people for thousands of years. This is a very annoying thing. It's annoying to a mind that wants to understand. Right? It is here, but it does not have to be. Now, here's the thing. What's the difference between 2 + 2 = 4, or the Pythagorean theorem, and the fact that the chair is here right now, or the fact that the universe is here for the same price? The chair may be easier to get in your head, but either way, what's the fundamental difference? The fundamental difference, Chassidus would explain to you, is that the mathematical truths so described are truths beruchnius, which I will translate in a moment. The chair being here is a truth more begashmius. Beruchnius means spiritually, it's connected to the word ruach. Gashmius physically, connected to the word geshem for rain, which is very interesting and we can't get into it now. The wind and the rain, so the spiritual and the physical. Anyway, the mathematical truths are spiritual, and the worldly truths are physical. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong idea that these two things are like polar opposites, that there's a real dualism, because in Judaism there isn't. And in fact, in ancient philosophy there wasn't either, really, is the truth. We've spoken about this in one of our classes before, a long time ago. A few months ago we spoke about this, that the physical is really partially spiritual, the spiritual is really partially physical. It's more of a spectrum than a true dualism, that there's two totally different realms. But the point remains that the mathematical truths are much more spiritual, and the physical universe is much more physical. What's the difference between the spiritual and the physical? In the sense of their being, such that the spiritual, I can understand why it must be so, but the physical, I cannot see why it must be so. The difference between them is that the spiritual is much more true than the physical. The spiritual is much more true than the physical. What does that mean? What do I mean by true? I mean that the spiritual is far less contingent, far less dependent on what happens to be than the physical. Really, I'm just rephrasing the question in different words, right? The spiritual, when I say 2 + 2 = 4, or I say the Pythagorean theorem, it's true because of its teichen. What it is means that it is. Yeah?
Yes.
explaining something subtle. What it is, the nature of what is being discussed, if you can understand what the Pythagorean theorem is, you will see that it must be so. Right? The physical is really Alma de Shikra, as we would say in Aramaic, the world of lies. The physical does not contain the same amount of truth. The what it is of the physical, understanding what something physical is, does not necessitate that it should be. There is no logical connection. This is actually what makes it physical. That's what physicality is. Physicality is a brute reality that divides the what it is from the that it is. Right? It divides the inner meaning of the thing from the fact that it is here. Physicality means something can be here without having to have any claim on being whatsoever, right? If something exists in space and something exists in time, it's here. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter whether it deserves to be here. It doesn't matter whether it has to be here or might not be here tomorrow or might not be here 5 seconds from now. Its reality is completely contingent. It's the entire existence of the thing is defined simply by external factors, whether it takes up space and whether it takes up time. If it exists within space and time, we say it's here in the physical realm. In the spiritual realm, 3 plus 2 equals 4 takes up no existence. It does not exist. 2 plus 2 equals 4 exists. Right? And the reason why one exists rather than the other is based purely on what they are. Purely on what they are. If you understand what 2 plus 2 equals 4 is, you will see that it must be. Whereas 3 plus 2 equals 4, if you understand what it is, you realize that it cannot be. And it's everything's existence reflects its nature. Why is this discussion relevant to everything we've been saying before? Because the point the point to drive home is that really the physical reality is really a reality of nothing. Physical reality is really a reality of nothing. The Alter Rebbe is not just saying that it's miraculous that something should be created from nothing, but it is natural for something to continue. The Alter Rebbe is saying that if we understand what something is, what yesh is, we will see that its true nature is to return to nothingness as well. The Alter Rebbe is really saying that the fact that the cup exists is more contradictory than the fact that the water should stand as a wall. If we were inquiring enough, in other words, if we were true philosophers at the level of the Alter Rebbe, right, maybe with a bit of godliness as well. Maybe you have to be not just a philosopher, maybe you also have to have an neshama. But if you were really inquiring and you really wanted to know the true nature of the cup and you delved into it, you would realize that the true nature of the cup is to be nothing, which is more contradictory than the sea standing like a wall. And Rabbi Yoel explains it at a few different levels, right? For example, right? If someone comes and tells you that they saw a rock flying up into the air, right? You wouldn't say, oh, I guess the rock is flying by itself, right? The rock is just flying through the air. You would say there must be a source, there must be something that is making this rock fly through the air, right? It is this very realization that led the vast majority of the philosophers of antiquity, the great philosophers, to an understanding that there must be a God. Something very similar to this, right? The initial question of why is there anything at all, right? This distinction between the fact that the world is here, but that it cannot, by what it is, explain why it is here. There is nothing about it that tells me why it's here. This leads to the natural conclusion that there must be a cause making it be here. Right? Just like if someone tells you they see a rock flying up in the air, to the philosopher, to the person who's intellectually curious and truly awake, and the truth is that this is much more by children than by adults. Adults learn not to ask the question anymore. Right? Children much more naturally have such a question. Right? That if you look at the world, you'll see it's as strange as a rock flying up. There must be something this is not natural. This cannot happen by itself. Right? It's because the world's nature is really to be like the rock lying on the ground. Right? Because there is no explanation, naturally, in the fact of what the world is, there is nothing that explains why it must be here. Yes? Then there's even further, right? So that means that the world requires a creator, right? A creator whose energies are constantly involved in creating a world. Then you have a friend who comes and tells you, I'm just telling you what Rabbi Yoel says, by the way. He's responsible for all of this. Anything that's wrong with it, I'm responsible for. Everything that's right about it, he's responsible for. So you have another friend that comes and tells you, I saw a square circle, right? Seeing a square circle is a contradiction, right? If you know what a square is and you know what a circle is, you'll understand that the two things cannot be.
Miracle.
Right? Miracle.
A square that rolls.
Yeah, square that rolls, exactly.
Square wheel.
They actually have square wheels, but the road has to be, there's a certain shape the road has to be, right, with divots.
Limestairs like that, isn't it?
Yeah. Limestairs, exactly. So the square circle is a miracle, right? Contradiction, really. In fact, it's even, the truth is that the first level is really a miracle. I don't want to get into this. Contradiction is really even a higher level of miracle. Contradiction is almost like makom arnein min amida, right, or the burning sneh, the burning bush. Yeah, godliness, a demonstration. It's almost beyond a miracle. It's sort of like a miracle and a non-miracle at once. There's all sorts of different ways of explaining it, but that's for a different class. So you have the an even higher level of miracle is truly a contradiction, right? If such a thing were to exist, that were truly a contradiction, you wouldn't just say, "Oh man, I guess something must have caused this." You would say, "Wow, this is really weird." Right? There should be a square circle. In fact, I'm not even sure I understand what I'm seeing, because the human mind can't really understand such a thing, right? It doesn't even make logic. Someone says they saw a square circle, you should ask them to describe what they saw. It would be very entertaining, because there is no human capacity for even understanding what that means, right? It's like saying I saw someone riding a horse and not riding a horse at the same time. I was like, please explain. So that's a contradiction. But even this is not really the chidush of the creation of the world something from nothing. The creation of the world something from nothing, Rabbi Yoel says, is like if your friend comes and he tells you, I was walking down the street and I saw nothing.
Yes, I say that every day.
It's like absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, right? It's if there's one way of seeing nothing, which is absence of evidence, right? That you just you happen to not be paying attention. But your friend, he was paying attention, and he was walking down the street, and he actually saw nothing.
He wasn't Stevie Wonder.
No, not like that. No, that's the thing. He has the ability to see. His vision is working just fine. It's that he happened to see nothing. He happened to see nothing. So the question is, what is there to understand, right? If you ask your friend to describe a square circle, he'll tell you, you know what a square is, right? This is what will happen. You tell your friend to describe the contradiction. He'll tell you, you know what a square is. You know what a circle is. Now just imagine that they could both, the parts where they contradict each other and are completely different and can't be the same thing, that was a little bit blurred, right? There was sort of a smudge around that, and somehow they were able to both be the same. But you know what a square is. You know what a circle is, right? And you can understand, just like you know what a wall is, and you know what a sea is, so you can imagine a sea standing like a wall, right? The square circle is a little weirder, but same general idea, right? This isn't the combination I'm describing is impossible, but you understand both things that are combining, right? When your friend walks down the street and he sees nothing, right? You ask him to describe it, there's simply nothing to describe. Right? It's not that there's two different things coming together, or there was a nature that was negated, right? He simply saw nothing. There was a nothing there, and he saw it. There was a nothing there to see, right? This, says Rabbi Yoel, this is really the nature of the universe according to Chassidus, because nothing should be here. Nothing should be here, right? There is nothing about what is here that explains why it should be here. So nothing should be here, especially if you understand that it came from nothing. Nothing should be here. Once there was nothing. Once upon a time there was nothing. Now there is something. Yes? So when God looks at it, when God looks at the universe from the godly perspective, He sees that there is nothing here. Right? He sees that the world is completely dependent only on His expression. right? There's actually nothing here. In other words, the nothingness, the world being here, the existence of the world, is more of a contradiction than the splitting of the sea. Because splitting of the sea, there's a wall and there's water, and the two things are put together. The world being here, there is a fundamental nature of nothingness. There is no teichen to the world. There is nothing about it that says why it should be here, and yet it is. Right? It is a nothing in teichen, in content is the word in Hebrew. Content, like the teichen of a book, the subject, what the book is about, right? The world has no teichen in spiritual terms, right? The world is not like the Pythagorean theorem, which has a teichen. The Pythagorean theorem has a teichen, and therefore it should exist, right? The Pythagorean theorem says something that's true. The world does not say anything that is true, and yet it is here. So it is like someone who walks down the street and sees nothing. It's not two things coming together. It's nothing that yet somehow
can be seen.
Is something. Yes, that can be seen, is here, is nothing. Exactly.
Well, the Pythagorean theorem can be derived.
Correct.
You can't derive existence.
Correct, that's the point, exactly. That's 100% the point. That's exactly what I'm saying. So the existence of the world is really, in the logical sense, and from the perspective of ruchnius, from the spiritual perspective, in comparison to spiritual truths, the existence of the world is inherently impossible. It's not something which can be, right? So the nature of being itself is really non-being. Right? It's almost like saying, this is my own idea, so don't blame Rabbi Yoel, but it's almost like saying, not that I saw a square circle, but that squareness itself is circular, right? It's something completely illogical. It's completely illogical. It is pure contradiction. You're simply saying nothing, right? You are essentially saying nothing. And Rabbi Yoel finishes that it says in other Maimarim, although it doesn't say in Tanya, it describes different ways in which the being of the world is really nothingness, right? Which is the fundamental idea we're talking about here. There's other ways of understanding this, and you can actually see it within the world with contemplation, right? One way of seeing it that's brought in Chassidus, is that everything that does exist physically within the world is in the constant process of becoming nothing, right? A very famous, I think, a Bechaya on the Torah, right? That from the moment of a person is born, they already begin to wither away, right? The same is true of all physical reality. Everything that is, yes, headed toward entropy, right? It's the law of thermodynamics. Everything that exists is in a constant state of becoming, of unbecoming, right? Almost like the rock tends towards the earth. So physical things which are tend toward not becoming. So one way Chassidus says this thing is manifest even in the physical itself. And the other thing is, which is a very difficult idea for the last minute of class, but the other thing that's brought very famously in a famous mimer of the Rebbe Maharash, that the although I'm sure it was brought before him as well, that's just where I know it from, I should note, but the everything in the world really only is because of what's called in Hebrew harkava, rather than it being itself. Harkava means that everything in the world consists of other things coming together, right? Everything is composite, is the word in English, pardon me. Everything is composite in the world, which means what? Which means, unlike the Pythagorean theorem, which at some level, even though there are aspects, obviously, you have to have a triangle, and you have to have arithmetic, there's different aspects, obviously, and you have to have certain axioms of geometry, and yada, yada, yada. There is a framing for the Pythagorean theorem, but at some level, the Pythagorean theorem is irreducible. It has a reality of its own, right? You understand exactly what I'm talking about, and nothing else other than the Pythagorean theorem is the Pythagorean theorem. Same with 2 + 2 = 4, right? The world, everything in the world is a harkava. It is only itself because of other things coming together.
The 4 elements.
The 4 elements is one way of explaining it. There's different ways of explaining it. Yeah, the 4 elements is one way of explaining it, which I should note very quickly, that the 4 elements is described in Chassidus. There's a couple different ways of understanding it, but certainly the 4 elements are not referring to the same thing as chemical elements, which is a common beginner question in Chassidus. When we say everything is made up of 4 elements, to me the easiest way of understanding it is, as the Rebbe writes in a letter to someone, that there's a whole school of thought which holds that these elements are qualitative. right? That the four elements do not describe the material that make up the thing, they describe the qualitative nature of the thing, right? So in other words, the fact that the cup is solid would derive from the element of earth. Not that there's earth in the cup, or there's earth actually making the physical matter of the cup, but rather that the qualitative experience of the cup clearly shows a dominance of the element of earth. There's all different ways of understanding the elements, I just wanted to note. But yeah, as Ronnie says, that's one way of understanding the composite nature of everything, that the nature of a thing is we experience it as a composite of qualities, right? The cup is white, the cup has a certain weight, it has a certain size, right? And it has all of these traits coming together as an expression of the cup. And the only thing that makes it a cup, which, remember, we do believe it is actually a cup, right? God speaks it into existence as a cup. It has a nature, kos, which God is constantly speaking the cup into existence, using the Hebrew words Hebrew letters chaf vav samach, right? He's constantly speaking the cup into existence. But what is it that is actually here? The only thing that makes it actually be is the fact that all of these different qualities are held together in one essence, because it has no teichen. Right? Because it has no fundamental organizing principle. The only organizing principle it has is spiritual, right? Not in the actual physicality of the cup. The organizing principle that makes it a cup is spiritual, right? It is the essence of the cup as we perceive it. But the physicality of the cup is completely a composite, which demonstrates that really there's nothing there at all, right? It's all just the entire thing that's there is only the spiritual essence of the thing, which is the little bit of spirituality that's in the physical. If it were just the physical, there would literally be nothing there, because all the composite aspects would not be held together in one being, right? Which is, I know that was a very fast explanation of a very difficult idea, which maybe we can talk about it more next time. So the bottom line is that the Rabbi Yoel wants to say that, and really this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that the existence of the universe is not like the hand that has tsaras, that the miracle was only at the first moment, but I don't see why there needs to be a miracle the rest of the time. The truth is really the opposite. The existence of the universe is far and away a more miraculous, more contradictory, and a harder to understand thing, even though there is no... why? Because the nature of the universe is to return to nothing. The truth is that the somethingness of the universe does not explain itself at all, but rather constantly, if we actually think about it, constantly demands explanation for why it is here, right? It is not something which is self-explanatory at all. On the contrary, the beginning of all philosophy and all deep human thinking throughout history has started with the point that it is not self-explanatory. It does not explain itself at all. And in fact, if you really think about it, it is really nothing in what it is. The only reason it is something is because God is making it something at every moment. That's the fundamental point.
So I want to say something. I think, the issue of the